Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal, of course, is to show that everything is figure-outable. And today's guest expert is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. Dr. Tsipursky is a cognitive neuroscientist and expert on behavioral economics and decision-making. As CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, he spent over 2 decades consulting, coaching, speaking, and training hundreds of clients, including Aflac, IBM, Honda, Wells Fargo, and the World Wildlife Fund, many companies that we've all heard of. He has been featured in Fast Company, CBS News, Time, CNBC, Inc. magazine, and many other places, and he's the author of the best-selling book, The Truth Seeker's Handbook. Today, he's here to talk about his new book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. Welcome, Gleb. So wonderful to have you with us today. How are you?
Thanks so much for having me on, Jake. I'm doing great, and it's great to be here. I've been looking forward to this.
I have been looking forward to it as well. And boy, that's a mouthful. You have done so much. So my first question to you is, how? How have you gotten it all done?
Well, some of the decision-making techniques that I am researching, I am also practicing them. When you practice good decision-making, you have a lot more time and a lot more energy because you work smart as opposed to working hard. And that's the secret to my success.
Well, excellent. And I want to jump into Never Go With Your Gut. But before we do, tell us a little bit about the best-selling Truth Seeker's Handbook.
Yes, that was my first best-selling book. And, I wrote academic books before that. Academic books tend to not be bestsellers, and I didn't think that they would be. But this is my first best-selling book. It was written for a broad audience. It talks about how we can actually see the truth of reality. And, it's harder than it may seem. I mean, looking at our politics right now, a lot of people are not seeing eye to eye. In fact, there's interesting polling that says that about 80% of the whole public says that neither Democrats nor Republicans can agree on what the facts are. And if you can't agree on what the facts are, how can you agree on how to go forward? Well, you know what? Within companies, I have seen the same sort of divide where people in this company, sales can't agree on what the facts are with operations, and HR can't agree on what the facts are with legal. It happens all the time. So people are kind of blind to what the facts are. They're staring them in the face because it feels very uncomfortable to acknowledge hard truths. So the book, The Truth Seeker's Handbook, is actually how do you go about both figuring out what is the truth, because we all have blind spots, we all look at the world through rose-colored glasses, and we all tend to think of ourselves as better people than we are. That's one. And then, even just as importantly, how do you convince those irrational colleagues who are working with you?
It's them, not us, right?
Yes, exactly. Well, sometimes it is them. Sometimes it really is them. And that is the second part of the book. How do we actually convince those irrational folks what the truth is and what we can do actually? Because, arguments, debates, they just don't work. When was the last time you convinced somebody through arguing? It just doesn't work.
The person you're arguing with just turns off. They're not going to accept, they've dug in their trenches, and the more you argue, the more they dig in, and the more they dig in, the less likely you are to come to a consensus or meet even near the middle, let alone right at a good meeting of the minds.
You're exactly right, Jake. And that's unfortunately how our brain works. Our brain, what the research on this topic shows is that rhetoric, argument, is not meant to convince people of the truth. It's meant to win for your side. So when we are trying to convince other people to believe the truth, unfortunately, we're just using the wrong tools when we're using arguments. There are much more effective techniques that you can actually effectively use to convince people of what are the facts. And that's what I talk about in my book, The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide.
And one of the things that we often hear is people don't know what you're saying or don't care what you're saying. They only care and really remember how you made them feel. And how do feelings and the way that we interpret what's being said on an emotional level play into that truth seeker's formula?
Well, what happens with our emotions people don't realize that emotions guide the vast majority of our decision making. In fact, research shows that about 80 to 90% of our decisions, our thought patterns, our beliefs, our behaviors are guided by emotions, not logical, reasonable thought. So if you actually want to get through to people, you don't target their belief, you don't target their thinking, you don't target their logic, you target their emotions. I developed a 5-step process that you can use to actually convince people to believe the facts. And it's called EGRIP: emotions, goals, rapport, information, and positive reinforcement. You don't start by giving them information that challenges their beliefs. Let's say, if a CEO thinks that he's awesome and therefore the company should be doing awesome, but the company is not doing awesome, you don't tell the CEO that he's not awesome. That's not the right way to go. You don't tell the CEO that, the sales you're the fault, you're the cause of all of those customers that actually were lost because the CEO was a bit of a screw up. So in fact, there is research done by Leadership IQ on 1,087 board members that fired their chief executive officers of 287 companies and other organizations, and they found that one of the top 5 causes for firing CEOs was denialism. 23% of CEOs were fired for denying the facts of reality that were staring them in the face. Not that they were not, there are plenty of companies that keep their CEOs when the company's in a tough spot, when the CEO clearly acknowledges the situation, says, here's what I'm going to do to address it. When the CEO says everything's hunky-dory, when it's not, you get the same thing that happened to Boeing CEO, a couple of weeks ago.
How often do you find that of these CEOs that, don't acknowledge the reality, don't acknowledge the facts, how often is it that they're intentionally denying them or intentionally not accepting them versus, hey, they really do believe that they're doing the best that they can or they're actually performing at a high level, and because of ego or because of narcissism or whatever it may be, they don't accept their role in what's happening to the company?
Now, there are definitely going to be a bunch of malicious CEOs, and you've seen that with examples like WorldCom, Tyco, Enron, where they knowingly, Bernie Ebbers and so on, knowingly used accounting fraud. They knew what they were doing to hide their losses. But you look at their decision making, they knew it couldn't go on for more than a year or two, and they had plenty of money. They had lots of money. They didn't need the extra bonuses, a couple more million. They lost so much more in reputation, in going to jail and spending many years in jail because of using accounting fraud. So they're still driven by their emotions, even though they're acting maliciously. And those emotions are preventing them from realizing the long-term consequences of their actions. They're facing to stare the truth of reality in the face. If they were, realistically looking at the situation and thinking, hey, where do I want to be in 5 years, they would not have used accounting fraud. So we have some proportion that are malicious. But the large majority of CEOs who were fired in that study were not malicious. They were just ignoring the facts of reality. Just like the Boeing CEO. I mean, if you look at the history of what was happening with the 737 MAX and Boeing, that's a very, very good example of where it wasn't a malicious CEO doing something to hide, but it was just a CEO who thought that the situation was going to be much, much better. Dennis Muhlenberg thought the situation was going to be much, much better than it actually was.
Well, and as companies grow and get larger, it's harder for the CEO to know all the ins and outs of what's exactly happening. I mean, if you're leading a team of 100,000 people, you don't know what every boots on the ground individual is doing. You have to trust your middle management and your senior management to report up the chain so that you know what's going on, right?
Well, I'll actually turn that around and say that what the research about this topic shows is that that's not actually quite the way it works. The way it works is that the CEO sets the culture, and the culture determines what gets reported up. There's a cognitive bias, one of these dangerous judgment errors that I study. I talk about them in both books, The Truth Seeker's Handbook and my new book, Never Go With Your Gut, called the mom effect, also colloquially known as shooting the messenger, where the person who brings the bad news up the chain of command gets punished, and then they stop bringing up the bad news up the chain of command. What actually works to address that is praising people and supporting people and promoting people and giving bonuses to people who bring bad news to the CEO. But you'll almost never see that happening, or very rarely, because most CEOs think that they are not going to punish the ones who bring bad news up the chain of command, but they actually do. They don't realize what they're doing.
It's one thing to talk about it theoretically and another to actually look at practically what's happening, right? I mean, if we take the emotion out of it and sit down and say, look, as a leader, if one of my team members brought me a problem, this is how I would react. It's quite another to put you in the actual event and see how you actually really do react to it. It's like people that are in dangerous situations. We may think that if somebody were to try to mug us, pull a gun on us, that we would do a karate chop and run away. But in the actual event, our reality may take over and we act differently.
That's right. We would, stand on our knees and beg like little girls. Exactly. Yes, Jake. So yes, that's how it works. And this is another reason why focus groups have been shown to not work by recent research. Marketers swear by focus groups, but when you actually look at the research, peer-reviewed research, double-blind studies, and focus groups totally don't work, because people in focus groups don't act like they do when they're actually buying the product, sitting there completely distracted by 100 things and making a decision on whether to buy something when they see it pop up in their news feed or something like that, or when they see the piece of mail coming into the mail, direct mail. So can't trust focus groups because people aren't acting in a focus group the way they're actually acting in a shopping situation. And when a CEO, he says or she says, here's how I would handle negative information. Yes, they're in an ideal, calm place. But when they, claim that they have an open door policy and somebody comes to them with some negative information, they get pissed at this negative information and then fortunately transfers over to the person who brought it. So getting back to Dennis Muilenburg, the former CEO of Boeing, you think that he intentionally gave all those misleading deadlines? If you recall back to what was happening with the 737 MAX, at first it was going to be back in June, then it was going to be back in September, then it was going to be back in October, December, January, March. Now it looks like it's not going to be back until late this summer. And that's one of the major reasons why the Boeing board fired him. They told him, hey, they expressed confidence in him for a long time. But all of these delays, clear incompetence on his part, show that, hey, he was not facing the truth of reality, and they fired him.
What about the situation where they do it for a public display of, this is for an image? I mean, we're talking about a massive company here that has gotten, punched over and over. The media has been very hard, and clearly so. I mean, we've had some very dangerous situations and lives at stake, things like that. How about the board reacting in a image conscious way rather than a practical, this is the guy that could help us dig out of this, versus, hey, this will cool the media and show that we as a board, and maybe help our stock price by showing that we as a board are taking proactive steps to minimize future error, loss, or delay.
Mm-hmm. If that was their mindset, which is totally legitimate mindset, and some boards do this, they would have fired him immediately after the crashes to address but they let him handle it. They thought that, hey, they had his confidence, and if he said at the very beginning, we will not have the 737 MAX back until December 2021. If he said that, and then suddenly you had it back by August 21, everybody would be praising him. Oh, hey, great, you got it for, right earlier than expected. Wonderful job, Dennis. I can guarantee to you, I'd place $50,000 on the fact that he would still have his job if he said it was going to be back by December 2021.
But doesn't that encourage us to under-promise and over-deliver? I mean, doesn't that, if he looked at the reality and said, look, I think we can get this done by August of 21, but I'm going to tell people we'll do it by December 21, and that way, I'm going to under-promise, I'm going to over-deliver. Doesn't that kind of mindset encourage us to prolong basically things that we know we could probably do earlier? It's like a team member setting a goal. Hey, I'm going to sell $1 million this year, knowing that they've already got $1 million client in the bag.
Well, I'll tell you, so what? Salespeople notoriously think that they have $1 million client in the bag, and they actually don't. When people say they're 100%, there's one of the cognitive biases that I researched called the overconfidence bias. And what the extensive research shows is that when somebody says they're 100% confident, they'll stake their farm, they'll, bet their career, bet the company, they're going to be wrong about 20% of the time. So you are, unless, the check clears and nobody wants it back in 6 months, you do not have that $1 million client in the back. I can tell you that. And I can tell you that as a CEO myself. I mean, I run a small company called Disaster Avoidance Experts, training, consulting, coaching. You want the check cleared and nobody to have asked back for that money for 6 months before you can be confident that it's actually in the back. So personal experience. So what happens with the giving of the dates, but getting back to the point that you made about giving dates, there's a specific cognitive bias called the planning fallacy. And this is a really interesting one. We tend to think that our plans will go according to plan. We think that because we're good, we have good plans, we're good people, we're going to be awesome. I'll give you so study on this. There was a group of college students who were asked, hey, if everything, and they had a long-term paper due. Half the class was asked, if everything went perfectly, everything went great, how long would it take you to turn in this term paper? And they said 11 weeks. Another group of college students who was asked, hey, how long do you think it will take you to turn in this term paper? And they said 11 weeks. Literally, this is exactly how people think. Our gut reactions, which is why my book is called Never Go Their Gut, is to imagine our plans as perfect. We forget all the problems, we forget all the issues. So if we think we're going to deliver it in December 2021, we're actually likely to deliver it, in July 2022.
Now, is there a corollary to that bias that says that those around us won't be able to deliver in nearly the time that it would take us? So, for example, I say it's going to take me, if everything goes according to plan, 11 weeks. Now, you may say the same thing, 11 weeks to get the term paper done. But if you asked me the next question, hey, Jake, how long do you think it's going to take Gleb, or how long do you think it's going to take somebody else to get the paper done? Would I not, as a corollary to what you just talked about, say that it would take you 15, 18, 20 weeks to do?
Actually, that's very insightful, Jake. One of the ways of correcting the planning fallacy is to look at outside of yourself at another person who would do the same situation. So if you are looking outside of yourself and say, so would the salesperson get the $1 million, or, is the $1 million client actually in the back? You would be likely to say, no, probably not. They'll probably miss that client for some of the time, for some of the reasons that are unanticipated. So we are actually much more likely to make accurate estimates about others because we can imagine we remember all the problems that happened to other people, and we remember how they screwed up and all the issues that happened. But we think of ourselves through rose-colored glasses. We think of ourselves as good people. We forget all the ways that we've screwed up in the past, just because that's how our brain works, and we screw up in the future. So I was working with a company in Pittsburgh, heavy manufacturing company, that was doing projects of heavy manufacturing industry, and they were bidding on contracts. So they would bid a contract that was $2 million, and they'd come in at $3 million. And so obviously bad for their profit margins. They'd bid $5 million, they would come in at $7 million. So sometimes they actually lost money, or they made much lower profits than they should have. And when they hired me to look at what's going on here, how can we address this, what I found was that they weren't looking back at their previous projects. They would finish a project and they would just go on to the next project and then go on to the next project. They wouldn't assess what went wrong in the previous project that caused them to go over budget and over time and so on. And once we had them look at it, say, hey, recruit, hiring manager, kind of bid manager, if you're going to make a bid, you have to incorporate previous information, including on what went wrong, into the new project. You have to be as part of the process. So we made a decision-making process, specifically process. They made their estimates much closer to reality. So if it was, 3 million, they would come in at maybe 3.3 million. If it was 5 million, they would come in at maybe 5.5 million. Much closer to reality because they were forced to incorporate previous problems into the bidding process.
And this doesn't just happen in development or construction, which it's very common to have these conversations where they bid 5 million and come in at 7. But even in everyday businesses, I coach a lot of law firms, and these law firms have no idea their cost of acquisition, how much they're spending in marketing, in reaching out to the customers, and also in production, how much time is involved in a service-based business. So when we're speaking to service-based business leaders on this podcast, this is something that they can also fall into, a trap that they can fall into. So the question I wanted to ask you, does our bias increase as we climb the corporate ladder? For example, as CEO, am I more susceptible to these biases that you just discussed, or is everybody equally at risk of overestimating what they can accomplish in the amount of time that is available?
As a CEO, there are certain biases that you're more likely to fall into, and I'll tell you what they are. You're likely to fall into the empathy gap. Now, what the empathy gap refers to is that you underestimate the importance of emotions in influencing other people's decisions, especially people who are subordinate. CEOs, when the higher you get up the ladder, and this applies to anyone who climbs the ladder in more managerial positions, the more senior you are, the less likely you are to consider the emotions of people in the lower roles. Kind of, if you're a peer, you will think of them as fully human, emotional people. If you're if you're a subordinate, you will really think about your boss's emotions. If you're at the top, you will greatly underestimate the emotions of other people. And in reality, as I said earlier, emotions motivate about 80 to 90% of our decisions. So one of the biggest reasons for the crisis of employee engagement, whether in service firms, law firms, consulting firms, all sorts of professional firms, or production, manufacturing, whatever you name it, that we have a huge crisis of employee engagement. About what the latest Google survey, Gallup poll on this showed that only about 34% of employees are highly engaged, which means that they really care about the job, they do innovative stuff. The rest either just clock it in or they're actively looking for a new job.
Yeah, and that's the group that really scares me, is those who are actively, and it's not just actively looking for a new job, but potentially sabotaging their efforts for you, and you're paying them to do it.
Exactly. And one of the biggest reasons for that is because the higher you go up the ladder, the more you ignore other people's emotions and you treat them like robots. You treat them like logical robots. They're not. They're overwhelmingly emotionally people. And if you don't think about their emotions because it's uncomfortable to think about their emotions, often, I've worked with HR people who don't think about other people's emotions, the people who are under them, because they really don't want to know what the employees are thinking about them.
They don't want to face the reality of the truth of what's out there. What would you say, Gleb, to employers that basically would take the approach of saying, look, I just want my people to come in, do their job, and then leave. I give them a certificate of appreciation every 2 weeks. It's called a paycheck. What more do they want out of me? I just want them to do the job, not, go down some of these paths. You and I are in agreement. I agree that we need to treat our employees with emotion, with humans. Realizing that they have hopes, dreams, motivations, inspirations that we need to recognize and acknowledge. But what would you say to people who aren't you and I, that may look at employees as cogs in their wheel that they need to keep oiled and greased, but that's about it?
Let me share a story about this to illustrate the situation. I'll give this from actually a client who let me name them because they gave me a testimonial about it. Edison Welding Institute, right here in Columbus, Ohio, where I'm based, go Bucks, have an engineering consulting firm of about 200 people who help other hard manufacturing firms, so hard engineers, welding and so on, help them solve technical problems. So they needed their engineers to do marketing for the firm, to spread, how awesome the firm is. They wanted their engineers to do more white papers, more blogs, more conference presentations. But the engineers are more fascinated with doing their technical problems, technical skills, and so on. So the HR is giving, and the leadership team, especially led by the HR, which is managing the communications, is giving them training in how to do marketing, conference presentations, is telling them how important it is for the company to get more sales. And you know what? And the engineers just aren't doing it. They're not doing the marketing conferences and whatnot. They're compensating them for it. Engineers aren't doing anything. So they're like, oh, are these engineers incompetent? Or are they lazy? They turn to me. They know I work on empathy and emotional engagement, emotional intelligence. And I come in, I do some interviews with engineers, some 360s, some group focus groups. I come back to my client, Mark Matson, who is the head of HR VP. And I tell him, hey, Mark, these engineers, they really aren't emotionally engaged with the goal of marketing. They're really not emotionally engaged. And Mark looks at me and he says, and I'm quoting here, engineers have emotions? Literally, that's exactly what he says. And engineers, they don't present themselves as emotional people. And Mark is kind of he's an HR person, tends to be emotional, but engineers are just as emotional as anyone else, as all lawyers, programmers, All sorts of folks are very emotional. We're emotionally motivated. We're emotional creatures. And you know what? The company was really going into a bad spot. They were losing money. They were losing clients because they couldn't motivate their engineers to do marketing, which was very important for them. So we changed. So we looked around. We saw what was actually emotionally motivating for engineers. We saw that social status, reputation was much more emotionally motivating for engineers than money, which was not very moving the needle, even though they were compensating these engineers for doing marketing. And we changed the reputational incentives, what the engineers were rewarded for. So who was given the prize in the company newsletter as engineer of the month, who was promoted up the chain of command, what it took to do promotions. And then they were much more willing to do marketing once social status, once personal brand, personal reputation was associated much more with actually marketing, doing blogs, conferences, white papers. So that's an example of where, and that's a story, an indication of where if a company needs to adapt to a new environment, where you want to change the situation, you have to change. You need your people to be behind you. You need them to have investment. You need them to be emotionally motivated. And tell me, what company in the modern day doesn't need to change to adapt to an increasingly globalized, disrupted environment?
Yeah, and one of the things that we often talk about is there is no maintaining. You're either progressing or you're sliding backwards. There's no, hey, we hit a great rhythm, we're just going to stay here for a little while. If you're not improving your team, increasing your offering, doing more, then you're sliding backwards. And sometimes that sliding backwards is because your competitors are just leapfrogging you. And so I could see this as a valuable story for our listeners to think about within their own companies, that sometimes we got to step back and play outside the sandbox a little bit and not take our normal biases or our gut, as your book would say. Don't trust that gut, because what we're seeing and what we're thinking about engineers not having emotions or lawyers not having emotions is patently false. And Gleb, I got to tell you, this conversation is so fascinating. I look down at our clock and we have run the length of the podcast, and there's so much more to cover. So what I want to do is I want to encourage our listeners to go grab a copy of your book. And in just a minute, we'll share where they can go grab that. But at this point, I'd like to shift gears and ask you a few questions about what you're studying and what you're reading these days. Does that sound okay?
That sounds excellent. And it's been a great conversation so far.
All right. So our first question then is, what is currently on your Kindle or bedside table? What are you reading?
My current book is The Secret Language of Leadership by Stephen Denning. It's about how to tell narratives effectively and inspire action for narratives. So I've been really building my skills in storytelling, and this is kind of my next level in building my skills in storytelling because, just like I shared the story about the engineers, that's a very important way to communicate effectively, and I want to improve my ability to do so.
Yeah, and I think storytelling is just an amazing way to communicate, and it's a way to not just share the facts and share the truths, but also to create that emotional connection that we've been talking about. Our second question is, what is your leadership superpower?
No question, decision making. Making the best decisions is my big leadership superpower. I apply that to my own career, to my own company, and that's been super helpful in helping have all of those achievements that you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast.
And I'm going to ask you now your motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra. But before I do, I want to tell you that one of my mantras is businesses grow at the speed of decisions. So where you talk about a superpower of decision making, I think that's an absolute function of business growth.
I live by Ben Franklin's "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." It's an incredibly useful quote to think about. And that's how I got the name of the company that I run, Disaster Avoidance Experts. A lot of people manage disasters. I don't want to do that. I'm not a crisis management. I help prevent disasters. And bad decisions lead to terrible disasters. And that's what I want to help people avoid. And that's what I was inspired by.
And if we had another 45 minutes on this podcast, I'd love to jump into one of my business philosophies. And that is, I believe because leaders are not being still, not thinking, there's so many distractions, so many fires that we're constantly fighting. Leaders aren't being still and being proactive about avoiding these problems. They're being reactive. And I think that's one of the biggest leadership crises that we're facing. But alas, we don't have 45 minutes. So I'll ask you the final question. And that is the book that you most often recommend or gift to friends, family, and colleagues.
Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. It's an incredibly useful book. He's kind of part of the first wave of scholars who are looking at these cognitive biases, the dangerous judgment errors that I'm talking about. I'm part of the second wave that actually looks at how do you address them, how do you debias them, how do you solve them. But he's brilliant in that book. He's a Nobel Prize Award winner of describing all of these cognitive biases, the way that our brain is screwed up. And that book actually was really helpful for me in elucidating my own thought pattern on this.
And I'm really looking forward to this second wave because I recently read the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and it didn't have enough stories. It didn't connect with me on that emotional level we've been talking about. And so I'm looking forward to some of these new applications of that research that tell it to me in a story that connects. So, for example, Never Go With Your Gut is right at the top of my list because I like the theory and the discussion topics, but I didn't resonate with the way it was presented.
Yes. So my book is, of course, much more storytelling based, shares the stories and pragmatic applications of all of these issues on the pragmatic story basis.
Well, I would love to continue going, but alas, our time is running low. So before we let you go, I promised that we would give them an opportunity to go and check out your book. Where can they grab this book and find out more about you?
The book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, is available in bookstores everywhere. It's published by a good traditional business publisher called Career Press. So in your local Barnes & Noble, University Bookstore, props to indie bookstores, or of course online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and so on. Check out my work at disasteravoidanceexperts.com. There's free blogs, articles, videos, podcasts, training, consulting, coaching, webinars, classes, and so on. Oh, talking about classes, very useful free course, 8 video-based modules course, as well as text and articles at disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. And finally, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm very active there. Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, GLEBTSIPURSKY.
And we'll link all that up on the show notes so they can go to one place, click on it, and connect with you. We know how busy you are, and we thank you for breaking away for a few minutes today to come and talk to us. This has been a fascinating conversation, and we appreciate you being this week's Modern Leadership guest expert.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, Jake.
Great. I just love that episode. I love talking to people who have spent their lives really researching what makes people tick, what makes companies grow, what makes a leader, and what we can do to avoid some of these biases, some of these challenges, some of the obstacles that leaders face as they grow, climb the ladder, develop, and their companies explode. Of course, everything that we talked about in this episode can be found at jakeacarlson.com/ML164, episode 164. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life, and of course, everything's figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.